All right, this morning we're going to cover about 15 chapters of Genesis in about 25 minutes, okay? So if you got your Bibles out this morning, we're going to whip through this very quickly because we're looking at the Abraham story, which is one of the central stories not only of Genesis, but of the whole Bible. It's a family story, and from here on, we're going to be seeing this family grow, and we're going to see this family become the means by which God is going to redeem all of creation. He's going to redeem the human family through a family, and it begins here with Abraham. But before that, let's review where we've been. We've talked about Adam and Eve. We've talked about how they failed to uphold the charge that God has given them. They're to be representatives of God in this holy temple that He has built in His creation, and yet they fail to do so. They fail in their worship. We see the curse begin to move outward into Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. We see it get worse and worse until we get to chapter 6 and the Noah story, which we talked about last week, the great flood that wipes everything out. But God, in His grace, saves Noah and his family. And after the flood, the text tells us God begins to work in a new way with humanity. They have a disease called sin. And despite their tendency to want to stray away from God, God decides to stick with these humans, to work with them, to save them, to preserve them as an act of grace. And then we get to chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story, which wraps up this section, and it demonstrates that human beings are still, even here at the end of this sort of prehistory period of Genesis, trying to make a name for themselves. I did a video on that this week. If you go to our YouTube page, you can dive deeper into the Tower of Babel story. But the first 11 chapters of Genesis then are a way of setting up the rest of this story and the rest of the Bible. We might say that these chapters describe in some way the spiritual origins as well as the physical origins of humanity, all the families of the earth. We learn why we are the way we are, about our need for God and God's saving power. And now we're going to be moving into what God does about human sin. And He begins again with another person. We move from the broader narrative about all of humanity to a more specific human family, the family of Israel. Knowing that the families of the earth were continually perpetuating this dilemma of sin and evil from generation to generation, God decides to choose one man, and through him, one family, to be the vehicle through which the whole human family might be saved. We might say that the story of Abraham, then, is the beginning of a journey, a pilgrimage, where this family and God begin to move forward together. And it's a family that we are part of, grafted in, as Paul says, into this larger family. So this story is really our story. Now we meet Abram at the end of Genesis 11, and there he is the son of a prosperous herder living in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the cradle of civilization. Ur is located about 70 miles south of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. Abram seems to have been minding his own business with nothing special about him when God calls him. The text implies that God's choosing of Abraham really comes down to the fact that he was the one who was willing to listen. We said the same thing about Noah last week. Who knows how many other people God called and said, "Hey, I have a deal for you." And they went, "No, thanks." But Abram says yes. He was simply willing to buck the trend and to put his trust in one God. And that should give hope to those of us who think we have to have everything figured out before God can use us. You know, you don't have to. Abraham just went, "Okay," and he started walking. Now God comes to Abraham with a proposal, a deal, if you will. "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." The core of this proposal, this promise, this covenant, concerned land and descendants, a new home and a nation to populate it, a chosen people through whom God was going to bless the whole world. But this must have been difficult for Abram to grasp on at least a couple of levels. One, He's being called to leave behind everything that he knows and to set out on a journey with no clear destination. People in the ancient world generally did not do this. They tended to stay in place. Ancient cultures generally believed that their gods were territorial. So if you left a particular region, you were leaving those gods behind. If you were to take this journey, Abraham would be leaving behind security. And would he have to put his trust completely in this one God who very unusually promised to go with him. The second wrinkle in this story hits a little bit closer to home. Abram was being promised descendants, to be blessed, to be the father of a great nation. The ancients understood that blessing was something that was supposed to be passed on to an heir. In those days, a son. Problem? Abram has no children. His wife Sarai was barren, and now Abram and his wife were both old. Remember, Abram's 75 when God calls him. By the time we get to Genesis 12, he's 86. Their chance of having children was long past. God's proposal and promise to Abram must have seemed ludicrous. In fact, Genesis 18, Sarai laughs at the prospect. She thinks this is ridiculous. I mean, they're already deep into thoughts about geriatrics, and God comes to them talking about pediatrics. Things are getting weird, okay? But still, Abram says, okay, and he starts to go. Here's where geography can help us grasp what's going on. If you take a look at the map of the Middle East, you'll see that Abram's journey takes him across the Fertile Crescent and from Ur to Haran, where his father settles, and then from Haran to this land of Canaan on the Mediterranean Sea, a land that God would continually promise to the Israelites in the time of Moses. It was fertile and desirable, but there's a hitch. Throughout history, this area of the world has been the ground of empires. The Egyptians lived in the southwest, the Babylonians, later the Persians before them, the Assyrians all lived in that area. Further west were later the Greeks and then the Romans. All of them occupy significant territory and trade, and they're all trying to conquer more territory in this region. These empires, thus, are always bumping up against one another, and they wax and wane, but they're always on the move. Think of it this way. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, these empires might be thought of as rooms in a very large house, each one having its own space, but always trying to invade the other's space. Kind of like if you have two kids who share the same room and they put a dividing line down the middle, someone's always trying to move across the border, right, and conquer a little bit more territory. That's what's happening. But if all these empires are rooms in a house, where does God put Abraham's family and the nation of Israel? He puts them in the hallway. He puts them in the hallway where they're constantly being run over, constantly being on the move in exile and mission, constantly being conquered, constantly having to move out. To put it another way, God's not trying to build an empire through Abram. This is important. He's building a family, but a family that would be forever on the move. A family that would ultimately move out from its territory, whether voluntarily or by force, and impact the whole world with a message of blessing. In other words, God puts them in a place where they have to engage the creational mandate. What was the creational mandate? Fill the earth and subdue it, be fruitful and multiply. So God begins to work with Abram. But Genesis reveals that Abram has some flaws. After arriving in the land promised to him, Abram soon discovers that the land of Canaan is locked in a famine, so he's forced to go to the more fertile territory of Egypt at the time. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. And there, as a prosperous herder, he fears for his life because his wife, Sarai, even though she's older, she's beautiful, and he figures the Egyptians might fancy her. Pharaoh might want to add her to the court, and in the process, bump off Abraham. So they concoct this story where he says, well, this is my sister, and Abraham takes her into the court. Then he finds out, and the Pharaoh gets upset. Abraham's embarrassed, but things tend to work out okay. The point is, Abraham's still a little bit afraid. God's called him, says, I'm going to go with you, but he's still hedging his bets. And then there's this whole idea of them having children. Sarah does not believe that God can deliver on the promise of an heir through her. So she decides to circumvent the process and have Abram sleep with one of her servant girls, Hagar. If the servant is able to have a child, then Abraham would have his heir. Now, when you read Genesis, it makes days of our lives look really tame by comparison, okay? There's a lot of stuff going on here. So Hagar, the servant girl, has a son. His name is Ishmael. Boom, there's your heir, right? Good to go. But God makes it clear that Ishmael is not the promised child, not what God had in mind when he first called Abraham. Though God cares for Ishmael and his mother, the Muslims, many of them trace their lineage back to Ishmael. He becomes a nation of his own. But God says, no, this is the plan. God sticks with Abraham, even giving him a new name. Abram meant exalted father. Abraham means the father of a multitude. Abraham and his family will be marked as different from the rest of the world, not only through their loyalty to one God, but also through the mark of circumcision. God is forming a new family, and he has not given up on the promise, even as Abraham is skeptical. God has made a covenant, and he will stick to it. This is the consistent thread through the whole Bible. What we also see as we look at the story of Abraham is how this covenant is played out in relationship. See, God doesn't merely send Abraham out on a mission and then stands back to see if he'll do things correctly. God engages Abraham personally, and Abraham talks with God seemingly person to person. They have an intimate relationship. In Genesis 18, Abraham's nephew Lot, who's been traveling with him, decides to go down and live in Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a hopping place, right? So down in Sodom and Gomorrah, things are getting out of control. They're getting bad. And God comes to Abraham and says, you know, I'm looking down at Sodom and Gomorrah. I think I'm going to smoke them. I think I'm going to take them out. Nuclear blast. It's coming. Abraham, though, instead of saying, yeah, let's make that happen, I'll sit on the hill and watch, he says, well, God, what if there were 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Would you stay your hand there? God says, okay, for 50, I'll do it. Okay, since we got to 50, how about we go to 20? And he starts to bargain, and he gets God all the way down to 10. If you can find 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, I will relent from judging Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, there aren't 10 people, and God winds up doing it anyway. But the point is that Abraham is bargaining with God. He's got that kind of relationship with God. I love that. It shows a depth of connection that continues to grow throughout the story. And through that, we see that Abraham's journey with God is more than geographical, it's spiritual. It's a journey that carries all the way through the succeeding generations in the Old Testament to the time of Jesus, and then all the way to us. The Bible calls this journey faith. This was the point that the writer of Hebrews makes when he talks about Abraham as a model of faith. By faith, he journeyed where God told him to go. But he also realized that he would not be the one to reach the final destination. Look at Hebrews 11:13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them at a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. In this relationship with Abraham, God was setting the agenda for the renewal of creation, a renewal of the whole human family. But that renewal would not happen in one God-altering moment. It would happen over time and through this relationship between God and this family. That better country is the place where the relationship between God and creation is fully restored. Now, we're not there yet. We're still in this family story. But God is calling us, like Abraham, to start moving in that direction. But while faith is what characterizes the journey with God, the Bible also makes clear that faith is more than simply buying into an idea. It's more than simple intellectual assent. Biblically speaking, faith requires a complete commitment. A commitment that is tested by circumstances, tempted by opportunities to go in a different direction. And according to Genesis 22, faith is even tested by God. God tests Abraham by calling him to take his long-awaited son and sacrifice him. It's interesting, we have little Isaac here today, but imagine Abraham's waited decades in his life for this heir, and finally he is born, and then about 10 chapters later, God says, now take your son, your only son Isaac, take him up on the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him before me. Listen to what he says, chapter 22, verse 2. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, none of us read that text and just go, oh, that's easy, right? It seems monstrous to us. What kind of God would call Abraham to sacrifice the very son that God had promised him? And what kind of father would simply agree to God's demand? After all, Abraham, remember, he bargained over the lives of strangers in Sodom and Gomorrah. But when God tells him to kill his own son, Abraham says nothing. Is it blind faith and arbitrary commands to which God calls us? Now, Jewish and Christian commentators go round and round about this story. It's called the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. You know, it's a story that has lots of interpretations over the centuries. Some have said that it's an early foreshadowing of resurrection, that Abraham obeyed because he believed God would raise Isaac from the dead. The writer of Hebrews seems to imply this in his writing. Others have speculated that Abraham actually fails the test because he doesn't push back at God, noting that in the text, God never speaks to Abraham again after that event, nor does Isaac ever speak to his father again. Well, duh. If you'd been under that knife, you might think differently. But as I look at it and study it, the sentence that leaps out to me most in this story is the one that Abraham uses to respond to Isaac's question. They're on their way up the mountain, and they're going up to sacrifice, and Isaac asks his father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham says, God himself will provide the lamb. Abraham had trusted God to varying degrees by this point. God had tested, but God had also provided. And now in this ultimate test, Abraham trusts that somehow God's promise was going to be kept, that the promise of descendants would not end right there on the mountain. God puts Abraham to the test. But Abraham is also testing God's provision, and he holds nothing back. We like to talk about God's provision. We don't like to talk about testing. We think faith should be easy, not difficult. We're uncomfortable when God asks something big from us. We're willing to give God some, but not all of ourselves. We separate our lives into what is ours and what is God's, and we would rather God keep his hands off our stuff. And yet Abraham seems to have learned that everything he had belonged to God, even his son. And that God always keeps his promises. Somehow, even in the midst of a scenario of death, God will bring life. Faith means trusting God even when, and especially when, the circumstances seem lined up against us. Abraham had that kind of faith. And God provided. Walter Brueggemann, in his excellent commentary on Genesis, writes this. He said, there are deep problems with asserting that God both tests and provides. The problems are especially acute for those who seek a reasonableness in their God. But this text does not flinch nor pause at the unreasonableness of this story. God is not a logical premise who must perform in rational consistency. God is a free Lord who comes to us as he will, as the high holy one. God tests to identify his people, to discern who is serious about faith and in whose lives he will be fully God. And as the one among the humble and contrite, God provides, giving good gifts which cannot be explained or even expected. We are not permitted by this narrative to choose between these characteristics of God. God tests and God provides. So this is not an easy story for us to digest, and the answers are incomplete. But there's one thing we must remember: God does not ultimately require Isaac's death. He provides a ram instead. Yet when God is faced with the same choice on behalf of all of humanity, God allows the sacrifice. Look at Paul's words in Romans 8:32. God did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. The test that God gives Abraham is the one that God himself will pass on our behalf. A provision of salvation for us all. A story of death becomes the ultimate story of life. I love this story because it illustrates in a powerful way that faith requires us to be all in. To be all in with God, to recognize the provision he has for our lives. God holds nothing back from us, says Paul. But what are we holding back from God? We sacrifice ourselves and our children to lesser gods all the time, don't we? Money, pleasure, jobs, other selfish reasons. What would it mean to offer ourselves, our families, our livelihoods to the God who provides for us? You know, we live in a kind of nomadic culture these days. Everybody seems to be on the move, except in York County. You know, it's very interesting. We moved back to Pennsylvania, and we came from Colorado, and we were in Utah for a while. We're out west for 25 years. Nobody is from there, okay? Everybody moves there. There were more Steelers stickers in the parking lot of my YMCA in Colorado Springs than there were Broncos stickers, okay? That's because Pittsburgh's a good place to be from. But we live in this nomadic kind of culture. People here tend to stay in place, and that's great. Multiple generations do that. But did you know that the average American moves 11.7 times in their life? Some of you are going, okay, yeah, we do that. That's a lot of boxes. But while we seem to be a culture that moves a lot physically, we seem to want to stay rooted in one place spiritually. A writer named Joseph McClellan puts it this way: in many ways, if we depend upon our roots to define us, we create a rigid little outline of what our relationship with God is. We take on the attitudes and we accept the priorities of the communities in which we live. But what we gain in physical comfort, we lose in spiritual exercise. It is far easier to grow lazy and complacent when we are rooted in place. Once you settle down on your own land, turn the humble tabernacle into a great temple, and exchange nomadic customs for agricultural and urban ways, it seems peculiar to pattern your life after a pilgrimage. Since you're really not going anywhere, you begin to think that God stays put too. But the story of Abraham tells us that God doesn't stay put. God is always on the move. And he's calling us to be as well, moving out to engage the mission of following him, to be a blessing to others, to go into the unknown and uncomfortable as a way of changing the world and renewing God's creation. And the more we journey with God, the more we see possibilities, because we know that God always follows through on his promises. Isaac, the promised son, was indeed born to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah's barrenness, which may also represent the barrenness of humanity, the end of the line without God, was overcome by God's faithfulness and fruitfulness. The promised family became a reality with God's help. The impossible was made possible by God. Knowing how that works takes a lot of time, a lot of walking with God. We have to be in it for the long haul. I love the story about a pastor who baptized the baby, and after the baptism, the pastor said to the child in a voice loud enough to be heard by the parents and the whole congregation, "Little sister, by this act of baptism, we welcome you to a journey that will take your whole life. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of God's experiment with your life. What God will make of you, we know not. Where God will take you, surprise you, we cannot say. This we do know, and this we say. God is with you. Where's God calling you to go in your life these days? It may not be a physical move like it was for Abraham, but God is always calling us to go into new places spiritually and personally to live out his covenant purpose for our lives. Now, you might say, well, that's great if you're younger, but I'm older. I'm kind of done with that now. Remember, Abraham was 86 when this whole thing got started. It's never too late, my friends. Where's God calling you? Maybe it's a call to a new profession, a call to a particular service opportunity or ministry, a call to share Christ with your neighbors or coworkers. Whatever it might be, we're called to go. What do the first two letters in the word God spell? G-O, go. In case you didn't answer, so I filled in the blanks for you. What do the first three letters of the word Satan spell? Sat, okay? Yeah. If you get nothing else out of today, you got that at least. But wherever God's leading you, there are two guarantees I'll give you. One is that a call from God is going to stretch you out of your comfort zone. As a friend of mine likes to say, you can always tell if a call is coming from God if it's to something you cannot accomplish on your own. That's clear. What's that call that God may be nudging you toward? A God-sized dream that you are putting off because you figured out all the logistics of why it won't work. Spend time considering the Abraham story. The most important words in that story, Abram went as God told him, and the world was blessed. How might your answering the call further God's covenant blessing? The second guarantee is this: wherever God calls you, God will be with you. It's the constant refrain in the Bible. God promises it to Abraham. Jesus promises it to us. I will be with you. Not only would God be with us in the sense of standing behind us and walking beside us, but we also know God is already ahead of us. If God is really calling you, all you need will be provided. As my friend J.D. Waltz says, if it's God's will, it's God's bill. He'll make it happen. It's a matter of trust, a matter of faith. Through Abraham, an elderly man way past his prime, God launched a rescue plan for the whole world. Imagine what he can do with you. May God give us that kind of imagination and open us to hear his call. May we go as the Lord tells us.